All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into lean startup methodology. We want to equip you with the core principles, and all in about 15 minutes. We'll see how those can be applied in the real world. It's kind of like a crash course in building a successful business, and it doesn't really matter what you're working on. Our main guide for this deep dive is Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup.
One of the most fascinating things about Lean Startup is how it kind of broadens the definition of a startup. It's not just about tech companies and garages. Rees defines it as any group creating something new amidst uncertainty.
So not just like launching the next big app or gadget.
Exactly. And this is crucial because it means the principles can apply to so many different scenarios. Government agencies trying out new programs, nonprofits testing innovative approaches,
Yeah.
even teams within big companies trying to, shake things up.
That is exciting. So this could be useful to almost anyone. Are there any examples of big companies using this approach?
Absolutely. Rees talks about Intuit, a massive established company, using lean startup methods to create their mobile app SnapTax, and they managed to build and launch it in a fraction of the usual development time.
Intuit using lean startup. That's pretty encouraging. So if this methodology is for everyone, what are the key takeaways?
Well, Rees outlines 5 core principles. Entrepreneurs are everywhere, entrepreneurship is management, validated learning, build, measure, learn feedback loop, and innovation accounting.
5 principles. Sounds manageable, but those sound a bit jargony, to be honest. Can we break those down?
Absolutely. So the first one, entrepreneurs are everywhere, really reinforces this idea that it's not about your job title, but rather your mindset if you are creating something new in an environment where, you don't have all the answers, you're essentially an entrepreneur.
So anyone who's trying to do something new can benefit from these principles. What about the second one? Entrepreneurship is management.
This principle highlights that building a successful startup, it isn't just about having a brilliant idea. It's about managing the uncertainty, navigating the chaos that comes with creating something from scratch.
So you're not just winging it. There's a structured approach to the whole startup journey. That makes sense. All right, let's move on to validated learning.
Validated learning is all about testing your assumptions. Startups aren't just about building products. They're about constantly learning and figuring out if your idea actually has legs.
It's like gathering evidence to support your brilliant idea,
Yeah.
right? So how do we go about doing that?
That's where the build, measure, learn feedback loop comes in. It's all about creating a minimum viable product, or MVP, as quickly as possible. You then measure how people interact with it, learn from their feedback, and refine your product.
The MVP. So we're not aiming for perfection right away. It's more about getting something out there to test the waters.
Precisely. It's about validating those core assumptions as quickly and efficiently as possible. Instead of spending months, perfecting a product, you're getting it in front of users to see if you're even on the right track.
And this is where that common saying about successful entrepreneurs never giving up
Mm.
seems a bit misleading. It seems like sometimes knowing when to give up is actually the smarter move.
You're absolutely right. The myth of perseverance can be dangerous. There are times when the best decision is to change course based on what you've learned. For example, I remember reading about this startup that spent months refining their product, even though their key metrics were completely flat. They were so focused on not giving up that they wasted, valuable time before realizing they needed to pivot.
So how do you know when to pivot versus when to persevere? I feel like that's a critical question for anyone starting something new.
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something we'll dive deeper into. But first, let's tackle the 5th principle, innovation accounting.
Innovation accounting. Okay, that sounds a bit intimidating. What is that all about?
It might sound complex, but it's simpler than you think. It's a way of tracking progress that's specifically relevant to startups, moving away from those traditional business metrics. Think about it. In those early stages, revenue might be low, but what you're really looking for is validated learning. Are you proving or disproving your hypotheses?
Okay, I'm starting to see how that shift in thinking can be important. Do you have an example of how a company has used this approach in a real-world setting?
Of course. Rees highlights Grokkit, an education startup. They were initially focused on the wrong metrics, like total users and questions answered, which gave them a false sense of progress. It wasn't until they shifted to cohort analysis and split testing that they began to get real insights into what was working.
Cohort analysis and split testing. Those sound like powerful tools. Could you break those down a bit further for us?
Imagine you're tracking users who signed up in January. With cohort analysis, you follow how many of them are still active in February, March, and so on. This shows you if you're retaining users, which is a much better indicator of success than just looking at total sign-up.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about looking at trends over time, not just a snapshot of the present. What about split testing?
Split testing is where you show different versions of your product to different groups of people at the same time. By comparing how each group reacts, you can figure out which version is more effective. It's like conducting a science experiment on your product.
It's fascinating how this approach is all about data and experimentation. It takes away the guesswork and replaces it with concrete evidence.
Exactly. And that brings us back to your earlier question about knowing when to pivot or persevere.
Mm.
So knowing when to pivot or persevere really comes down to setting those measurable goals, those learning milestones that we talked about earlier. This gives you concrete data to base your decisions on, not just your gut feeling.
So we're not just setting these vague goals like let's get more users. We need to be like laser focused and specific.
Right. Exactly. For example, let's say your hypothesis is that simplifying your sign-up process will increase your conversion rate by 10%. You make the changes, you run the experiment, and then you carefully measure the results. Did you hit your goal? If not, it might be time to reconsider your approach.
It's all about using data to validate your decisions.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of a company that successfully navigated this pivot or persevere dilemma?
Absolutely. Rees tells the story of David Benetti and his political startup. He was diligently tracking his key metrics and noticed they weren't improving fast enough, even with his best optimization efforts.
So he was brave enough to change course based on the data. What happened?
The results were impressive. His key metrics improved dramatically. It really underscores the power of having that data to back up your decisions. Sometimes perseverance isn't about stubbornly sticking to your original plan. It's about being adaptable and making changes when the data tells you to.
It's like the old saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Okay, so we've covered the core principles, the importance of MVPs, innovation accounting, and how to decide when to pivot or persevere. What else do we need to know to build a successful startup?
Well, once you have a product that's, showing some promise and gaining traction, you need to figure out how to drive sustainable growth. That's where Eric Ries's engines of growth come into play.
Engines of growth, those sound powerful. What are they? How do they work?
So Rise identifies 4 main engines: sticky, viral, paid. And then kind of combination of all 3. A sticky engine is all about retaining your existing customers. Think of products that people use habitually, like, a productivity app or a subscription box service. The goal is to keep those customers engaged and coming back for more.
Like building a loyal fan base for your products. So what about viral growth? Isn't that the holy grail for a lot of startups?
Viral growth is incredibly powerful when it works. It's all about getting your customers to do the marketing for you. Think of products like Facebook or Hotmail, back in the day. They spread rapidly because using the product naturally involved inviting other people to join. It's like a chain reaction.
That's amazing when it happens.
Yeah.
But I imagine not every product lends itself to viral growth, right?
You're right. And that's where the paid engine comes in. This is your classic advertising model, where you're spending money to acquire new customers. The key here is to make sure your customer lifetime value, or LTV, is higher than your cost per acquisition, or CPA. Basically, you need to be making more money from your customers than you're spending to get them.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot where your marketing efforts are actually profitable. Makes sense. And what about the 4th engine, the combination engine?
The combination engine is just what it sounds like. Using a mix of sticky, viral, and paid strategies to drive growth, it can be incredibly effective. But it's also, more complex to manage.
Do you have any real-world examples of companies that have successfully used these engines to drive growth?
Well, we talked about Hotmail as a classic example of viral growth. They added that simple tagline, P.S. Get your free email at Hotmail, to the bottom of every email, and it spread like wildfire. As for the sticky engine, imagine a company selling, collectible items. They're constantly adding new items, offering a great user experience to keep those collectors coming back for more.
So they're creating a platform that keeps their users engaged and coming back for more. What about the paid engine? Can you give us an example of that?
So imagine a B2B startup that initially focused on acquiring customers organically through content marketing and word of mouth. As they grew, they realized they needed a more scalable approach to reach larger clients, so they pivoted to a paid model. Investing in targeted advertising and attending industry events, this allowed them to reach a wider audience and accelerate their growth.
Okay, so we've covered the engines of growth. This has all been incredibly insightful. What happens when those engines start to sputter? What's next?
That's an excellent question. It's where the concept of the adaptive organization comes in.
Adaptive organization. It sounds almost like a superhero team. What does that even mean in the business world?
Well, it's not about capes and superpowers, but it is about being ready to evolve. An adaptive organization is built for continuous learning and change. They embrace experimentation, they're quick to identify problems, and they're not afraid to, pivot when necessary.
It makes you think of those companies that seem stuck in their ways, doing the same things even when the world around them is changing. They probably aren't very adaptive, huh?
Probably not. Adaptability is all about being agile, being data-driven, having a culture that encourages experimentation and learning from mistakes.
Okay, so how does a company actually become an adaptive organization? It seems like that would require a pretty big shift in mindset.
It does. It's about changing the way people think about work, about success, and even about failure.
Do you have any real-world examples of companies that have successfully made this transformation?
Let's look at the team behind QuickBooks at Intuit again. They used to work in large teams with long development cycles. It was slow and made it difficult to adapt to customer feedback.
So they were kind of like that big lumbering company we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But they knew they had to change. So they started implementing lean startup principles. They broke down into smaller teams, shortened their development cycles, and started working in a more iterative way.
So they went from like a giant waterfall to a series of smaller, faster sprints. I bet that was a huge change for them.
It was, but it allowed them to become much more responsive to customer needs. They even invested in new technology to support this way of working. For example, since QuickBooks is a financial software that people rely on heavily, they couldn't just release buggy MVPs. They had to find a way to test new features with real customers without putting their data at risk.
That's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
How do they manage that?
So they built a system that allowed them to run multiple versions of QuickBooks on a single computer. The new version could, access the customer's data, but couldn't actually make any changes to it. This let them test new features in a safe environment.
That's a really clever solution. It allowed them to get real feedback without jeopardizing their customers' data. So what were the results of this big transformation?
Well, their customer satisfaction ratings went up, and they sold more units. They were able to build a better product because they were able to learn and adapt more quickly. It was a win-win for everyone.
That's a fantastic story. It really shows that these lean startup principles can work even for big, established companies. It's not just about scrappy startups in garages.
Exactly. It's a mindset, a way of approaching work that can benefit any organization that's trying to innovate and create value in a rapidly changing world.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? Why should they care about lean startup?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Rees argues that our biggest challenge now isn't building things. It's knowing what to build. He highlights how much time and energy is wasted on building the wrong things, even if we're doing it efficiently.
That's such a powerful point. It's not just about doing things right. It's about doing the right things.
Exactly. And the lean startup methodology equips you with the tools to figure out what those right things are. It's about testing your assumptions, learning from your mistakes, and adapting quickly to create something truly valuable.
So for all of you listening, I want to leave you with this question. What wrong things are you working on? And how can these lean startup principles help you identify them? Food for thought, my friends.
A delicious and nutritious meal for your mind.
That's a wrap for today's deep dive, folks. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of lean startup. We hope you've learned something new and are feeling inspired to go out there and create something awesome.